We're in the book of Acts, chapter 21, verses 27 through 40. And really, I'd say that our missionary journey, most people will say that's over when he makes it back to Jerusalem. So we call this today, Paul is almost killed in a riot. Acts 21, 27 through 40. I know that's a lot of verse, but it's take all verse to get the whole thought. And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law in this place. And further brought Greeks also of the temple and hath polluted this holy place. For they had seen before with him in the city Trophimus and Ephesian, who they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. And as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar, who immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down unto them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left beating of Paul. And the chief captain came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and demanded who he was and what he had done. And some cried one thing, some another among the multitude. And when he could not know the certainty for the tumult, he commanded him to be carried into the castle. And when he came upon the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers for the violence of the people. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying, "Away with him!" And as Paul was being led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, "May I speak unto thee?" Who said, "Canst thou speak Greek? Art not thou that Egyptian which before these days madest an uproar, and leddest out in the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers?" But Paul said, "I'm a man which am a Jew, of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city. And I beseech thee, suffer me to speak on the people." And when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with the hands unto the people. And when there was made a great silence, he spake unto him in the Hebrew tongue, saying, and hear that message, you'll have to come back next week. Paul is almost killed in a riot. We have 3 divisions. Number 1, seized by a mob. Acts 21, 27 through 30. Number 2, saved by the Romans. Acts 21, 31 through 36. And number 3, seeking permission to speak. Acts 21, verses 37 through 40. A little bit of review. So Paul ended the 3rd missionary journey, making it to Jerusalem in time for Pentecost, bringing an offering by the Gentile churches to the poor saints in the Jerusalem church. Now, they had given Paul a bad rap. They had accused him of, as he went out ministering and speaking against all the Jews and telling the Jews throughout where he went that they didn't have to obey the law and they didn't have to circumcise, which was absolutely untrue. They taught the Gentiles who became believers that they didn't have to observe the law or circumcision. So James and the other elders in the Jerusalem church, they gave Paul advice. They said, "Here we have 4 men who have taken vows in a 7-day process, and to show the Jews that you you respect the law and you obey it, you also take a vow. You go with these 4 men and you pay for their sacrificial animals that are used. So Paul agreed to do that. They were probably Nazarites who had taken temporary vows and had become ceremonially unclean, and they had to go through a 7-day process. And at the very end of that, they would completely shave their heads, and they would be giving animal sacrifices. So that's the process of what Paul is doing with them when this occurs. Number 1, Paul is seized by a mob, verses 27 through 30. And when the 7 days were almost ended, and these 4 men, the Jews which were of Asia, and probably they were from Ephesus, because the man that they have seen is from Ephesus. So these are unbelieving Jews who do not believe in Jesus. So they saw Paul in the temple and they started a riot. Now let's talk a little bit about the temple. You have the temple building, which is the central part of the temple complex, but that the holy place can only be entered by the priests. No, daily they offered the incense. We see John the Baptist's father went in when the angel appeared to him and said that he and Elizabeth would have a child. Then you have the Holy of Holy Places, the holiest place, and only the chief priest could go once a year on the Day of Atonement. You had the area outside that only the priests and Levites could go. The outermost part of the temple was called the Court of the Gentiles, and anybody could go there, Jew, Gentile. That is where they did a lot of their teaching. Jesus taught there, the apostles taught there. They had Solomon's porch, which gave you shelter from the sun. But inside that, the next court, the Gentiles could not go there. And there were signs at the entrances going farther in, and it said, basically, any Gentile who goes past this point does so at the risk of his life. And by the way, the Romans would allow the Jews, in this case, to execute any Gentile that went farther into the temple. So they're probably in the temple of farther in as the Court of the Gentiles. So they see Paul in the temple, which is okay, but they're stirring up all the people and they laid hands on him. And they cry out, "Men of Israel, help! This a man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and along this place. Teacheth all men everywhere against the people," the Jews. Paul didn't downgrade the Jews. On his missionary journeys, if the city had a synagogue, he went there first. And he taught through the scriptures, the Old Testament, that Jesus was the Messiah. That's what he taught. He loved the Jews. Romans, he spoke about how he would give his life if all of Israel could be saved. He loved the Jews. So going on, and they said, and he speaks against the law. Paul wasn't against the law. And he never told the believing Jews who became Christians that they had to quit observing the festivals and all the things that they did. He never did that. Now to the Gentiles who became believers, he told them they didn't have to obey the law, which they didn't. They didn't have to circumcise their boy babies. And he goes on, and he speaks against this place that is the temple. By the way, that similar charge was made against Jesus. And these charges were made against Stephen also. So one of the charges against Jesus was a false charge. Jesus said he's going to destroy the temple in 3 days and he will rebuild it. That's not what Jesus said. Jesus, speaking of his body, said, you destroy this temple, kill his body, and in 3 days he would raise it, that he would rise from the dead. And he did. Paul did not speak against the temple. Now, A.T. Robinson pointed out that Paul did teach them that you could worship God at other places besides the temple. And the last charge, and further that he has brought Greeks also into the temple and hath polluted this holy place. That he had brought Gentiles, Greeks, Hellenists, non-Jews, and past the outer court of the Gentiles, and so has polluted the temple complex. Why did they do that? Because verse 29, earlier that's the Trophimus, an Ephesian Gentile who is a Christian, and they saw him in the city with Paul, and they just assumed that Paul had brought him in the temple. Now nobody saw that, they just assumed that, which was a totally false charge. Man, you can get yourself in trouble in a big time, in a hurry, assuming things. And they assumed that Paul had brought him in the temple, and that's probably the thing that really caused him to go ballistic and start a riot. So verse 30, and all the city was moved, and the people ran together. Well, I'm imagining, they're shouting this out, and word is getting out. They're telling their neighbors, and it's spreading. The news is spreading like wildfire. And that people are just flocking into the temple complex. And it's just about to get out of hand. So they ran together, they grabbed Paul and drew him out of the temple. I believe the word literally says they are dragging him out of the temple. And then after that, the doors were shut. Why did they do that? Why did they shut the doors? Why did they take him outside? Because they didn't want to shed blood anywhere in the temple complex, lest that would cause it to become unclean. So we see Paul is seized by a mob. Number 2, he is saved by the Romans, verses 31 to 36. And as they went about to kill him, there's no doubt about their intentions. They were going to kill Paul, and that's what they started to do. And while they were doing that, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. So there in the temple complex, there's a higher rock northwest of the temple complex. Herod the Great built a temple there and named it Antonia in honor of Mark Antony. And there were 2 flights of stairs that led to that fortress from the temple entrance. So it was said that they always had a guard watching the temple complex in case they had a riot or things got out of hand. They had lots of problems among the Jews. We saw in the Sunday school lesson today there was a man named Theudas, who caused rebellion. He was killed. A man named Judas of Galilee. He caused problem and he was killed, and all of his followers scattered. So the Romans were quite experienced in dealing with rebellions and riots and trouble in Jerusalem. So there, called him the chief captain. The Greek word is chiliarch. If he had a full bunch, and he had 1,000 soldiers, that would be probably 10 centurions who were over 100 soldiers. And it was full force. He had 1,000 soldiers in that fortress to keep peace and order in Jerusalem. So word gets from the chief captain of the band, of the army, that all Jerusalem was in uproar. They're having a riot. So no delay, verse 32. Immediately he took soldiers and centurions, plural, so you have at least 2 centurions, you have at least 200 soldiers. So he sends at least 200 soldiers, sends them down and runs down to them. And when the rioting crowd sees the chiliarch, I think RSP has the tribune, and when they saw the commander and the soldiers, and they quit beating Paul. They were beating him to death. That was their intention. And when the soldiers came down, they quit. So the chief captain came and took Paul and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains. And he wanted to know, who is this guy? And what has he done? Obviously, the riot was around Paul's. What has this guy done? Who is he? Is he the cause of all this trouble here? He wanted to know. And so he asked the question, and so the crowd, one part of the crowd, they said, "Oh, it was this." Another part of the crowd said, "No, it's something else," and they really didn't know, and he couldn't figure out exactly what had happened. So probably what had happened was the troublemaking Jews from Asia who started this ruckus, when they saw the soldiers, they probably left. They started it and they left because they didn't want to get into trouble. So the commander, he cannot get an answer from the crowd, so he gives commandment to get this man and carry him up into the castle, into the barracks. Castle is actually a pretty good word. Now, the King James Version was translated in the 17th century, 1600s, and in those days, the English idea of a castle was a fortress. And Antonio, it was a fortress. The problem with this castle is really not a bad translation. So we commanded, get this guy and carry him up there into the fortress. And so, when they were doing that, because of the crowd was so violent, I imagine they're probably grabbing at Paul, and I don't know, maybe people were hitting him as he's going up. It was so bad, the soldiers, they had to pick him up and carry him to keep the crowd from trying to kill him. It was that bad. Verse 36, the multitude of people, they were following them up the 2 sets of stairs, crying, "Away with him." That is, killing him. That's exactly what they did to Jesus. When Pilate offered to release Barabbas to them, a prisoner, or Jesus, Barabbas was a murderer, insurrectionist, they actually chose to let Barabbas go. What about Jesus? Away with him, kill him, crucify him. I mean, this crowd, they were worked up, and they wanted Paul dead. Now we go to number 3. Paul is seeking permission to speak. 37. As Paul was to be led in the castle, I imagine he probably gets to the top set of the stairs. He speaks to the chief captain and he says, may I have a word with you? And the man was surprised and can you speak Greek? See, the Jews in the Holy Land, they spoke Aramaic. Some of them knew Greek, but Aramaic was their main language. And even the Jews of Western Asia, they spoke Aramaic. So the commander, he was surprised that Paul spoke in Greek. 38. So he says, are you that Egyptian who before these days made an uproar or riot and led us out in the wilderness 4,000 men who were murderers? Josephus gives two accounts of this Egyptian. He was an impostor, he was a false prophet. And about 3 years earlier than this, he led a group of 4,000 men to the Mount of Olives, which of course is real close to the temple complex, Temple Mount. And he promised that the city walls would be leveled before them, and they would be able to overthrow the Roman armies. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. The walls didn't fall down. And the Romans killed about 400 of them and captured thousands of others. But the Egyptian, he escaped. And so this commander thought, are you that Egyptian who caused that ruckus about 3 years ago and you're back trying it again? The word for murderers or assassins actually is the word for a small knife or a dagger. And so it can be used of murderers or assassins. These people, they would get these small knives and they would hide it in their clothing. And one translation called them, I believe, dagger bearers, because they were carrying knives in their clothing to be able to kill people. Well, obviously, Paul wasn't that man. 39, Paul said, I'm a Jew. I'm from Tarsus, which is a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city. A little bit unusual to say it that way. No mean city means it wasn't not an insignificant city, which really means it was a significant city. I'm from Tarsus. It's an important city. It had a great university of learning. In that one commentator said they actually had more of a reputation for learning than even I believe, Athens or Alexandria, a couple of places. And so, and I beg you, please allow me to speak to the people. You see that crowd? Give me a chance to speak to them. He wanted to give his side of the story. Paul had been slandered with things that were not true. And he wanted to be able to give his side of the story and tell the truth. So verse 40, and the captain allowed that. Verse 40, when he had given him license or permission, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with a hand on the people. I don't know what he did, if he tried to silence them probably, or maybe come this way and listen. I guess I want to tell you. You know, if that happened today, probably the crowd, they would have shouted him down when he giving him a chance to talk. But this group, at least, they gave him a chance to talk. We'll see that later messages, Lord willing. So finally the crowd came to silence. And he spoke unto them in the Hebrew tongue, really Aramaic, saying, and we'll get that message later, Lord willing. 3 lessons. The world watches us. We who are followers of Jesus, the world watches us. And boy, when one of us goofs up, they tell it to everybody. They let us have it. But also, when we do good, the world notices that. And when we live for Jesus, and even in the bad times, and when we're in the valleys, and yet we can have a good outlook and be nice and pleasant, and not just having a poor pity me party, the world takes notice of that. Unbelievers, they looked at Paul, they watched Paul, and they had it in for him, and they thought they had him, but it was a false charge. May we live lives of holiness for the Lord, that the world will have nothing negative to say about us that is true. Number 2, believers suffer. I mean, they were in the process of beating Paul to death until the soldiers got there. And evidently they didn't quit because the soldiers, they had to pick him up and carry him up the stairs because of a violent crowd. The devil hates us. And he and all the demonic forces, all fallen angels, they're against us. And they make our lives as miserable as they can. We suffer. Jesus said, does the world hate you? Don't be surprised it hated me first. Does the world persecute you? Call you bad names? Don't be surprised it did the same thing to me first. And number 3, God helps us. In our troubles, in our difficulties, God is there to help us. Praise the Lord for that. And of all things, he used the Roman soldiers to deliver Paul from that violent Jewish crowd of unbelievers. If we're in the center of God's will, we'll be here in this world, and God will give us whatever protection he deems best. And we won't be destroyed or killed until our journey is over and we have completed our task. But when our task is over, when our time is up, then we will go home, whether it is through sickness, death, accident, execution. For many of the early believers, their exit to heaven was being martyrs for Jesus, of being beheaded or burned alive or crucified, or having their heads cut off like Paul. So hopefully for us, we won't get to that state. I think the Lord Jesus will come back for us before it gets that bad. Their place in the world now gets that bad. But God helps us. If God be for us, who can be against us? Praise the Lord for that. And let us be closed in prayer. Matt, would you close us in prayer?
Dear Father, thank you